Where are all the foreclosures? Hi, I'm Amber Coleman with Guild Mortgage. I've been doing loans for over 20 years. I have ridden all kinds of different markets, and let's talk about this for a second. So, a crash. So, we all remember 2008. That's what's ringing in our heads to be able to understand like what happened and expecting it to happen again, because there are some similarities right now with basically how high the prices are. But here's what we have to look for. Where are the foreclosures? So when we're talking about the market and we're talking about it might go down, the reason why it would go down is because there's a lot of inventory. Now, is inventory climbing? Yes, absolutely. Inventory is climbing. We're now approaching the point of a buyer's market. I personally think that's a beautiful thing. I'm so excited for buyers to start being able to call the shots, get a deal on it, maybe ask for closing costs and get it from the seller because they don't have a million offers on the house. But to take away some of the fear about what's happening, in order for us to see inventory climb to huge levels, what we saw in 2008 was inventory climb to massive amounts of levels. I mean, inventory climbed to huge levels, way more inventory than there was buyers, and that's where the problem was. When there's more inventory than buyers, then the supply-demand issue is off balance in the opposite way as it has been during COVID, right? So one thing that I'll look at is, okay, so, I want to be honest with whatever I'm doing. I want to be able to see things truthfully and explain them truthfully. So one thing I've been looking at is, okay, if we're going to go through a big market change, which we are going through a market change right now, there's no doubt about that. But a crash means a huge amount of equity lost in your house. So a crash means, why would you buy if you're going to be able to buy a house for way cheaper, right? So one thing that I've been looking at is inventory and foreclosures. So the reason why we got there in 2008, 9, 10, 11 is because people couldn't afford their payments. Number one, they got into subprime loans. Those loans were mostly on 2 to 3 year ARMs. So they already had a higher interest rate because it was a subprime loan. That's what most loans were back then. And the rate was only fixed for 2 to 3 years. So when you're looking at a 2 to 3 year ARM, after that adjusted, your payments skyrocketed. I was in the same boat. I had a house. My payment was $3,500. I had it on a 2 year ARM. I just figured I'd refinance it after 2 years. That was the mental thought process at that point because everybody was doing it, right? This is why we try to say, don't always follow the crowds because it's not always the right thing to do. Everybody was doing the 2 year ARMs. That's where they're offering the low interest rates. That's where they're offering the incentives as banks. So I took the 2 year ARM. I had a $3,500 payment. The minute that ARM adjusted, it was $4,500. I could no longer afford my house. Did I want to let it go? No, I didn't want to let it go, but I couldn't afford it anymore. Okay, so a lot of people had to foreclose on their properties simply because the rate adjusted and they couldn't afford the mortgage anymore and the banks weren't working with them. So what's been taken out of that equation right now is everything's on a 30-year fixed. Very few people did ARMs in the last 10 years because honestly they weren't available and they weren't any better than the fixed loans. So when you're looking at the inventory, the way that we gained so much inventory at that point, a lot of it had to do with ARMs, subprime lending, or people just walking away because they didn't have value in the house and they can rent cheaper. So we had a lot of foreclosures, right? That's what happened in 2008. So one thing I'm looking at right now is, okay, so when are we going to start seeing the foreclosures if we're in a similar market? Here's one thing that we're missing right now. During COVID, pretty much anybody that was a homeowner refinanced their house at a 2 to 3% interest rate. That put their payment way lower than anything that you could ever rent for. So people aren't going to be leaving a house because there doesn't have any equity to rent another house because you need a roof over your head, right? So if majority of society in America has a 2 to 3% interest rate on their house and their payment is lower than what it would be if they rented a house, why would they walk away from it? They wouldn't walk away from it. So when we're looking at our inventory and we're waiting for a crash, that would mean people would have to foreclose on their properties. We're not going to see the foreclosures if people can avoid it because they have a super low rate, super low payment, and they can't move to another house and repay and replace that payment. They can't rent for that amount. The other factor in this is that rents are so high right now. So a lot of the hedge funders have come in and they bought the houses. They bought them because during inflationary markets, we can see higher interest, or they can receive higher rents, right? When everything's going through inflation, they're going to be able to collect higher rents. So they took advantage of the market and they bought houses to rent them out to you. And so with that, we're going to be having high rents, and anybody that's in a house is going to stay put because they have super low interest rates. So we won't be seeing inventory climb. Now, climb to the point of a crash. Now it's climbing to the point of a buyer's market, which is beautiful because, like I said before, buyers can actually get into houses right now. Buyers can go into a house and say, I don't have any money. I need to do a grant program on this. And there's grant programs available. Or they can go into a house and say, I don't have any closing costs. Seller, can you please pay my closing costs? And if the seller doesn't have any of their offers on the table, then chances are they're going to look at paying their closing costs. So in a buyer's market, it's actually a really pretty thing for a buyer to buy in that type of market. Now, do I think the prices will go down a lot more? I know that there's a correction, and here's what I think about the correction. There was so much greed. The greed was out of control during the time of COVID. And I mean, honestly, really, especially in 2021 and the beginning of 2022, the greed was out of control. Sellers would list their houses for whatever crazy amount, and it didn't really matter what the house appraised for, because either somebody's going to pay cash for it, they're going to put a large down payment, or they're just going to pay over appraised value for it to make up the difference. The greed was crazy. So what it means when we correct is the greed goes away. Does this mean the houses are dropping to crazy low levels? No, they're not. They're dropping to what the house is appraised for. If you can really catch somebody like that's fearful right now as a seller, you might even be able to get it less than that, which is really an awesome thing as a buyer. So going back to the original question is, where's the foreclosures? I think they're going to be waiting for a long time if you want to see foreclosures. There's going to be an occasional person here or there that just can't make their payment anymore, but the massive amount of foreclosures that would cause the inventory to skyrocket and the housing market to crash, people have too low of interest rates. So let's take advantage of the correcting market, take advantage of sellers that might be a little bit scared right now to sell when they're selling their house, and they'll take the offer that's offered to them and get some closing costs from people. Ask for incentives. Let's use the buyer's market as it's meant to be used. You know, one thing I look at in business is there's always an ebb and flow, right? There's a time for the sellers in the seller's market. We just ended that. And there's a time for the buyers in a buyer's market. One usually follows the other, and it has to. And sometimes it stays kind of in the middle. Right now we're in the middle, and we're hedging over to the buyer's side. So if you're looking to buy a house, let's get you in. To rent a property is no fun right now, especially with how high they've gotten in rent. And honestly, if they're offering low rent, they get you into a lease, and the next year they raise the rent up on you, and they charge crazy amount of fees. Let's get you in a house. A lot of times what I'm finding right now is it's easier to qualify for a home loan than it is for a rental property. If this was informative to you, if you want me to run some numbers for you, I'm happy to do so. I'm going to put my information right on the screen. Feel free to reach out to me at any time. And I would love it if you liked and subscribed to my page for more updates weekly. Thank you.